In 1911, a luxury Italian train entered a tunnel with 106 people aboard and never came out. No wreckage, no survivors, just silence. But 100 years later, the train returned. What came back wasn't human.
Please subscribe my channel and enjoy the stories. In the annals of the unexplained, there are stories of ghosts and phantoms, fleeting shadows that haunt the corners of our vision. But some mysteries are not so ethereal. They are made of steel, steam, and the solid, screaming reality of 106 souls. This is the story of the Zanetti Viattore, a train that steamed into a tunnel in 1911 and vanished from the face of the earth, only to reappear, silent and frozen, a century later. It began on June 14, 1911. Italy was in the grip of industrial fervor, a nation forging its future in iron and coal. The Zanetti Railway Company, eager to prove its dominance, had unveiled its masterpiece, the Viattore, the Traveler. It was a luxury train designed for the wealthiest echelon of Roman society. For its maiden voyage, 100 tickets had been sold to a curated list of industrialists, their wives, artists, and even a noted journalist named Alessandro Volpi, who was famously skeptical of the newfangled technologies he was paid to document. Along with 6 crew members, 106 people gathered at Rome's Termini station, sipping champagne under the grand glass canopy. The train itself was a marvel. 3 carriages of gleaming wood, polished brass, and plush velvet. The engine was a brand-new model, the most powerful in Zanetti's fleet. The journey was a publicity stunt, a scenic day trip from Rome to Milan, showcasing a new, monumental stretch of track that included the Lombardy Tunnel. This tunnel was a source of immense national pride, a perfect, kilometer-long bore straight through the granite heart of the Apennine Mountains. It was a dark, straight line, a testament to man's ability to conquer nature itself. The departure was triumphant. An orchestra played, streamers flew, and the Viattore pulled away from the station in a great, confident cloud of white steam. For the first few hours, the journey was idyllic. Passengers dined on fine food, the Italian countryside rolling past their windows like a serene painting. Alessandro Volpi, the journalist, dutifully took notes, observing the clinking crystal glasses and the boisterous laughter of the barons. He noted the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in the carriage, a vibration that seemed just a little off. Around midday, the train approached the Lombardy Tunnel. The conductor announced its arrival, and passengers gathered at the windows to see the marvel. The train, with its horn blowing a proud, long note, plunged into the perfect, circular darkness. It was scheduled to emerge from the other side in just under 2 minutes. It never did. At the far end of the tunnel, the station master of the small rural stop waited and waited. The 2-minute mark passed, then 10, then 30. An hour later, a profound sense of dread had settled over the line. A rescue team was assembled and sent into the tunnel on a maintenance cart, their lanterns cutting weak circles into the oppressive, coal-scented dark. They traveled the entire kilometer. The tunnel was empty. There was no smoke, no wreckage, no sign of a derailment. The tracks were pristine, untouched. The Viattore, with its 3 carriages, its powerful engine, and its 106 passengers, had entered the tunnel and had, quite simply, ceased to exist. The resulting panic was absolute. The Italian government sealed both ends of the railway line and launched one of the largest missing persons investigations in the nation's history. They scoured the mountainside, believing the train must have somehow derailed inside the tunnel and fallen into an uncharted cavern. Geologists were brought in. They dynamited sections of the mountain. They found nothing but solid rock. The tunnel was a perfect, unbroken tube of granite. The only clue, and the one that was immediately dismissed by authorities as madness, came 2 days later. 2 men were found wandering in a daze on a hillside miles from the tunnel entrance. Their names were Carlo and Luigi, and they were in a state of profound shock, their fine suits torn to rags. They claimed to be passengers from the Viattore. They told a story that destroyed their reputations and landed them in an asylum. Carlo, the more coherent of the two, spoke of a sound. He spoke of how the train had just entered the darkness. "We had just entered the darkness," he whispered to the police, his eyes wide with a terror that never left him. Then came a noise. Not a loud noise, but a grinding hum, like a million wet insects. Then came the fog. It wasn't smoke, Luigi stammered, picking at his fingernails until they bled. It was white, milky. It came in through the cracks in the windows, under the doors. It was cold, so cold. It smelled of ozone and old. Carlo continued. People began to scream, not in fear, but in pain. The fog, it was touching them. A man across from me, his face, it just smeared like wet paint. In a fit of pure animal terror, Carlo and Luigi had smashed a window and thrown themselves from the moving train, tumbling onto the ballast rock just seconds after it entered the tunnel. They had scrambled up the embankment and run, never looking back. They were the only survivors. Their story was officially recorded as trauma-induced hysteria. The investigation was fruitless. The Zanetti Company collapsed into bankruptcy. The Lombardy Tunnel, now a place of national shame and supernatural dread, was permanently sealed. Its entrances were covered with tons of concrete, and the railway lines leading to it were torn up. The earth was allowed to reclaim the tracks, and the memory of the 106 vanished souls faded into a morbid, unbelievable folktale.
But the story did not end there. Throughout the 20th century, whispers of the Viattore surfaced. In 1955, hospital records from Mexico City mentioned 104 dazed and confused individuals who appeared overnight in the city's main square, all dressed in bizarrely old-fashioned clothes, all claiming to have arrived from Rome. They were detained for evaluation, but vanished from the locked psychiatric ward the next day. In the 1980s, a Soviet railway worker in Ukraine filed a panicked report of a ghost train moving silently along an unused track, its windows fogged from the inside, a description that perfectly matched the old Zanetti blueprints. These were dismissed as hoaxes, fragments of the original legend echoing through time. 100 years passed. The world changed. Steam gave way to diesel, then to electricity. Italy was now crisscrossed by high-speed trains that traveled near the very mountains where the Viattore had been lost. The date was June 14, 2011. Dr. Ilara Vess, a young, ambitious historian and physicist, stood before a crumbling wall of concrete, half hidden by ivy and trees. Ilara was the great-granddaughter of Alessandro Volpi, the skeptical journalist who had vanished on that train. His disappearance had become her family's obsession, a dark secret that drove her. She wasn't a ghost hunter, she was a scientist. Her controversial theories suggested that certain geological anomalies, under immense pressure, could create temporary, localized temporal rifts. The Lombardy Tunnel, she believed, wasn't haunted, it was a scar. She was there on the 100th anniversary, mostly for ceremony, to place a wreath at the sealed, forgotten entrance. She was accompanied by a local journalist and a photographer, documenting her pilgrimage. It was a still, humid afternoon. As Ilara approached the concrete slab, her electromagnetic field meter, a device she carried for her research, began to wail. It wasn't a subtle flicker.
The needle slammed into the red, vibrating violently. "What is that?" the journalist asked, backing away. It's impossible," Ilara whispered. "The readings are off the charts. It's like a massive, unshielded generator is running just behind this wall." At that moment, the photographer screamed. He was pointing at the base of the concrete seal. "Look, sweet Mary, look!" A thick, oily, milk-white fog was seeping from a hairline crack near the ground. It was not steam, it was heavy, clinging to the dirt, and it was impossibly cold. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds. Then came the sound. Not a train whistle, not the rumble of an engine. It was a low, grinding hum. A million wet insects, just as Carlo and Luigi had described. The ground shook. A deep groaning crack split the 100-year-old concrete seal down the middle. With the sound of a giant sigh, the two halves of the slab scraped outward, parting just enough for a person to slip through. From the darkness beyond, the white fog billowed, pouring out into the 21st century's sunlight. And in that darkness, something stood. Ilara, driven by a force she couldn't name, activated the flashlight on her phone and stepped through the gap. The journalist and photographer, terrified but bound by their profession, followed. The air inside was freezing, the smell of ozone and damp ancient metal overwhelming. The old rusted tracks, which should have ended at the concrete wall, were clear. And sitting on them, perfectly still, was the Zanetti Viattore. It was not her rusted hulk. It looked wrong. The brass was tarnished, the wooden panels coated in a strange pale grime that looked almost organic. The windows were opaque, covered from the inside with the same thick, milky white condensation. It was silent, utterly, dreadfully silent. "Hello?" Ilara called out, her voice absorbed by the cold. She approached the first carriage and wiped a clear patch on the window. She peered inside. The emergency lights from their cameras illuminated the interior. It was exactly as the 1911 photographs had shown. The velvet seats, the crystal glasses still on the tables, the half-eaten meals, and the passengers. They were all there, all 104 of them. They were not skeletons, they were not decomposed, they were perfectly, impossibly preserved, as if they were wax figures in a museum. A woman in a grand feathered hat sat with a champagne flute halfway to her lips. A portly industrialist was frozen in mid-laughter. And there, in a corner seat, was her great-grandfather, Alessandro Volpi. His notepad was open on his lap, his fountain pen still in his hand. They're sleeping," the photographer stammered, his camera clicking non-stop. "No," Ilara said, her hand trembling as she reached for the carriage door. She managed to wrench the frozen door open. The fog inside was thick, clinging to the floor. The cold was so intense it burned her lungs. She stepped inside, her boots crunching on a thin layer of frost. The silence was absolute. There was no breathing, no movement, just 104 statues, their skin pale and waxy, their eyes all closed. Ilara walked down the aisle, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She stopped in front of her great-grandfather. She could see the words written on his notepad. The last sentence was a frantic scrawl. "The fog is not fog. It is a presence. It doesn't kill. It, what?" Ilara whispered, her tears freezing on her cheeks. She slowly, terrified, reached out one finger and touched the back of his hand. It was not the cold of ice. It was a void, a coldness that seemed to pull the heat from her very bones. And as her living warmth touched his frozen skin, Alessandro Volpi's eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a man. They were pale blue, opaque, like frozen marbles. He did not gasp. He did not scream. He turned his head, a slow, creaking sound of frozen muscle and looked directly at his great-granddaughter. A collective, silent gasp filled the carriage. All around them, 104 pairs of eyes snapped open. 104 heads, in perfect, dreadful unison, turned to face Ilara and the two men at the door. The journalist screamed and scrambled backward, falling out of the train and onto the gravel. The photographer stood paralyzed, his flash firing over and over, capturing the impossible horror. Alessandro Volpi opened his mouth. A wisp of the milky fog drifted out from between his lips. A voice, dry as ancient paper, rasped through the carriage, a sound that was both a whisper and a shout, a composite of 100 voices speaking at once.
"It is not time,"
the chorus said. "It is a place. We are held." Ilara stared into the void of her great-grandfather's eyes. What happened to you?" "We waited," the voices replied. "We waited in the fog. We waited in the cold. We waited for the door. You opened the door." "Oh, God," the photographer whimpered, finally dropping his camera. A low hum began to vibrate through the train's floor. The ancient 1911-era electric lights above their heads flickered one by one, casting a sick yellow glow on the preserved, watching faces. "It's starting," Ilara breathed, a terrible understanding dawning on her. "It's not a ghost train. It's a trap. It's been waiting to arrive." The portly industrialist, who had been frozen in laughter, began to stand up. His movements were stiff, puppet-like, his joints cracking like ice. "The journey must be completed," the chorus rasped, the voice now coming from every open mouth. "Run!" Ilara screamed. She grabbed the photographer's arm and dragged him toward the door, tumbling out just as the industrialist's cold hand clamped down on the space where she had been. They scrambled back through the crack in the concrete, the journalist already halfway up the hillside. As Ilara fell onto the damp earth, she looked back. From the blackness of the tunnel, 104 pairs of pale, shining eyes were watching them. The milky fog was pulsing like a giant, cold lung. And then, for the first time in 100 years, the Zanetti Viatore's powerful steam whistle blew. It was not a sound of triumph. It was a low, mournful, hungry scream that echoed off the mountains. The authorities arrived within an hour, drawn by the frantic 911 call. Ilara, the journalist, and the photographer were detained, their equipment confiscated, their footage classified. They were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, threatened with treason. The official story, released weeks later, was that an old uncharted military bunker containing hazardous chemical weapons from World War I had been breached. The area was declared a permanent quarantine zone, a military exclusion site. The Lombardy Tunnel was not just sealed, it was filled from end to end with reinforced concrete and buried under thousands of tons of rock. It was erased from the map. Ilara Vess never practiced physics again. She lived quietly, haunted by the frozen eyes of her great-grandfather. The journalist never wrote another story, and the photographer never took another picture. But Ilara kept one thing. In the panic, she had snatched it from the train, her great-grandfather's fountain pen. Sometimes late at night, she takes it out. The metal is always cold, a cold that no room temperature can warm. The ink, she discovered, has never run dry. She will sometimes write with it, and the words that flow are not always her own. The mystery of the Zanetti Viatore was solved, but the truth was never told. It did not travel through time. It had fallen out of it. It had been shunted into a siding of reality, a cold, dark place where a predatory, sentient fog waited, preserving its catch. It had waited 100 years for a door to open, for a link back to the world it had lost. Ilada had provided it, and now the authorities had sealed it in, burying the 104 living, frozen souls and the thing that held them back in the darkness of the earth. But as Ilada knows, and as she writes in her secret journal with a pen that is never warm, a seal is just a door, and all doors, eventually, wait to be opened again.